Well, good Friday to everybody. When do you use the crossover solver versus when do you use the comparison solver? You know, those solvers can seem a lot alike, but they do have different uses. So, yeah, I'll use the chart from last week. I think this will work out good. And I'll use the BB MACD indicator. However, I think I'm going to recreate my chart though instead of using that indicator because not everybody has this indicator. So I believe the BB MACD was downloaded from Big Mike's. See if anybody's looking for it. But it also might be available, you know, on Ninja's download forum as well. So yeah, I think you can recreate this without this special indicator. So let me just get the settings here first. Okay. So I remember doing this a while back, and I believe this is quite literally just the MACD line and the Bollinger Band lines with the MACD fed into it. So well, let's see. Looks like this has a different scaling, this particular indicator. So I'll put it on a different panel. Let's see, put it on a new panel. And, yep, there we go. So it just has a different scaling applied to it. Oh yeah, it looks like they normalized the BB MACD to the tick size, which is a good thing to do. Alright, so we have our MACD line on the bottom there, and now let me add the Bollinger Bands. And we're going to feed the MACD into the Bollinger Bands. Okay, so what we get. Oh, let's see. I think I put it on the wrong panel. Here we go. Yeah, there we go. And you know, that looks awful close. Let's try and make this even look even closer. So let's change the plot style to the dot. There we go. Wow, those look very similar. I can see there's some subtle differences. But let's see. For now, let's see. Well, You know, the way I set these two indicators up, I guess it does get a little complicated to do that in BloodHound. Well, not complicated, but it takes a little more effort. So, Well, I think just because I don't really want to use this custom indicator here, I guess I'll just go ahead and use what I made. Alright, so the differences between the crossover solver versus the comparison solver. Kind of in short, the short answer is, you know, the crossover solver is just going to give you, you know, one signal if you get like the MACD line crossing over, you know, one of the bands. So I'm going to change the color here just a moment. Alright, so when we get the red dots, you know, crossing over one of the bands with the crossover solver, right, you would get just one signal, such as, you know, where the arrow would be, versus if you use the comparison solver, essentially you would get a continuous signal all the way up until like here. So this whole area you would get an output from the comparison solver. So you get a continuous output as long as the BB line is above the MACD line. And there. Alright, so just to repeat, you know, the crossover solver is good at giving you one clear, easy to read signal, whereas the comparison solver, it's kind of mainly used as like a filter or like a permissive, right? Because it's going to give you a continuous, you know, string of signals, you know, as long as the BB line is above, you know, whichever band you're looking for it to be above. So, all right, let's go ahead and, you know, put this into practice, and we'll add these on here. So, let me name our BloodHound file for today. Alright, so I'm going to do crossover versus the comparison. Alright. So we'll connect that crossover up, and we'll put our two indicators in here. So in indicator B, I'm going to make that the MACD line. And we want to make sure that the MACD line is selected down here, and it is, so we're all good there. And now in indicator B, we're gonna compare it to the upper band here. We'll just use the upper band. I don't believe I changed any of the periods on the chart, so I'll leave the parameters the same, and we're going to use the upper band here. And so right, you notice no signals. Why would that be? Well, that's because we're comparing the MACD plot to the Bollinger But normally the Bollinger is overlaid on price. Right? So right now this Bollinger has a totally different value. Right? So this Bollinger has, right, the upper band values are somewhere up around price. Whereas the MACD, right, it's down here around, 0.05. So, right, versus 102. So there's never going to be a crossover. So what we need to do is nest, remember, nest the MACD into the Bollinger, just as we did on the chart. And we want to make sure that the MACD line is nested in there. And let's make sure we change our MACD values like so. Alright, I believe, there we go. And it looks like I have some of the parameters not quite set right. So let me go, let's kind of put some the default values in here. That's a little easier to keep track of. Let's see. Oh, so here's a major difference. Our standard deviation is 1 on the chart, but the standard deviation in BloodHound, it was 2. So there's a big difference right there. But let me go back and change, and the MACD settings are way off here too. Alright, I thought I had fixed those. I'll leave that at 9. Alright. 12, 26, and 9. Alright, so I'm just going to remember I've got a 1 and a 14 on the chart for the Bollinger Band's parameters. And I will need to go into the indicator here and to make all the parameters match for the Bollinger Band. Alright, so we need to set this to 1. And let's see, we need to go into the MACD and set this down to 9. And there we go. Okay. Now it's all matching up. So great. We got the MACD crossing up the upper band, and then the MACD just drops down below the upper band and crosses back up, right? So the crossover solver is great at getting, one clear signal, when you actually have a crossover condition. A lot of people use the word crossover very loosely. And they'll say, well, I want the MACD to cross over the upper band, and then and then some other crossover condition. But if when you're writing down your condition or talking about your condition, if you ever mention 2 crossovers, one crossover right before the second crossover, then really your first condition here, when your first crossover condition really wouldn't be a crossover condition. What you're really looking for is for one indicator to be above or below the other indicator. So let's for example, let's say our rules say we need the MACD line to cross over the upper Bollinger Band, and then we need price to cross over our linear regression, like so. Well, the first condition really isn't a crossover. The first condition is really more of a filter or a permission. So really the first one's not a crossover, but it's really what we're looking for would be the MACD to be above the Bollinger Band. And in that case, if you're looking for an indicator to be above or below another indicator, and that's using the comparison solver. Okay, so really our first condition is we're comparing the MACD to the upper band. We're checking to see if the MACD is above or below the upper band. So next, we'll put the comparison solver in here, and we'll do the same thing. So we'll set indicator E, indicator A to our MACD, and we're just using the default settings now, makes it a little simpler. And then indicator B will be our upper Bollinger Band. And I just have to remember to set the standard deviation down to 1. And then the next thing is to nest our MACD into it. And alright, these parameters are good. We want to nest the MACD into it. Alright, that should be good. And so now, right, so we see something totally different from the crossover solver. Right, so the comparison solver is always giving you some kind of an output. Right, and so in this case, right, what the comparison solver is showing us is that essentially the MACD is above the upper band, and so we're clear to take a long trade when the next condition happens, right? And so just for the simple example, when the next condition happens would be, you know, price crossing above our our linear regression line here. So let's see, we can make this a little more advanced. So I can go into indicator B, and I could use the lower band for short signals, and you'll see now what I just did is that now the comparison solver is saying that, you know, we're clear to take a short trade whenever the MACD is below the lower band. If the MACD goes in the middle, in between the bands, then we can't take any trades, right? So whenever you have this, you know, whenever there's no output, that would essentially prevent the ability to take any trades. So it's kind of a little advanced way to take this signal. And let's see, how about if I name my solvers here? Right, so this is the MACD to the upper band. And this solver is the same thing. Alright. So these solvers essentially have the same name, except one's the crossover and one's the comparison. And next, let's add our second condition. Right, so we're looking for price to cross over this linear regression that we have up here on the chart. So I'll set indicator A to the closing price, and I'll set indicator B to our linear regression 80 period. Alright, so we can see we got a signal there, right, a long signal there, and another long signal there as price kind of bounced around a little bit. And so now, if we take the AND node, plug that in like that, right? So right now, we're looking kind of like at our first condition, right? Kind of our filter, checking where the MACD line is against its Bollinger Bands, right? We're checking to see if the MACD is above or below the bands, and then we can plug this in as our trade signal here. So let me give this a name first. Right, so we're looking for the close to linear regression 80. And so now, if I actually plug in the signal, and now we actually have some clear trade signals. So that's kind of how you decide, whether you're using the crossover or the comparison. So in general, like condition 1, whichever condition comes first, that would primarily be the comparison solver, right? So if if the MACD is essentially always above, if the MACD condition happens first, then you'll want this to be the comparison solver. If for some reason, if price typically would cross the linear regression first, and we'd have to wait for the MACD to catch up to price crossing the linear regression, then we would use price in the linear regression in the comparison solver, right? So whichever condition would typically happen first is the one that goes into the comparison solver, and then the crossover solver is typically going to be used for the final condition to actually trigger the trade, right, for the second condition. Celso's got one here. Could you go over what you just did on the settings? Let's see. Settings. So Celso, which settings? The indicator settings or the solver settings? Are we talking the crossover? Okay. So he's talking about go over what I just did on the crossover settings. Let's see. Well, really, I don't think I did anything on the crossover solver settings. I simply just, plugged in the closing price, and then plugged in the linear regression indicator, and that's how we got our crossover signals here on this chart. Well, if I expand this out a little bit, make it a little easier to see. There. Alright, so Celso would like a summary. Okay, sure, that sounds good. Alright, so let me disconnect that. So what I did is, just make up a set of rules just up on the fly. And, so rule 1 is, we want the MACD to be above the upper band or below the lower band, right? So here, how about if I copy this over? All right. So kind of, rule number 1, condition number 1, of this simple system here is, our MACD line has to be above the upper band or below the lower band. And so we kind of have these areas, based on this, first condition, of when we can take a short signal, right, or when we could take a long signal. And then condition number 2 is we're waiting for price to cross the linear regression in the same direction that our MACD gave us permission to take a trade. And a lot of people, the way they would describe something like this is they'll say, I want the MACD to cross above the upper Bollinger Band, and then I want price to cross above our linear regression line. And I guess technically, those aren't both crossover conditions. Technically, if we did look, if we put both of those conditions in as crossover conditions, let me show you what happens. Alright, so we have rule 1. We're looking at rule 1 here, right? So the MACD line crossed above the upper band, and we got our signal, right? Our trade signal. And then rule 2 is we're waiting for the linear regression, or I'm sorry, we're waiting for price to cross above the linear regression, like so, like it did over here, to actually, before we get into the trade. So here's what you get when you get two different crossover conditions, right? You get a signal on the first condition's met, and then you get a signal when the second condition's met. So really, the first condition down here, the MACD condition, really isn't a crossover condition. It's really a comparison condition, because we're just waiting for the MACD to be above the upper band before we can take the trade of price crossing the linear regression. Alright, let me clean this up a little bit. So really, back to condition 1. Condition 1 really is we're wanting to make sure the MACD is above the upper band. So it's not really a crossover. It's just whenever the MACD is above the upper band. Right? And the way I set this solver up, so that we have these areas right in between where there's no signal, right? So whenever the MACD is between the bands, is inside the bands there, right? There's no signal. And the way I set that solver up is indicator A is just looking at our MACD line, and indicator B is looking at our Bollinger Bands, but we're using the upper band for long signals, and we're using the lower band for short signals. So that's how we were able to get this unique kind of look here. Right? So I hope that makes sense to you guys, how that's working. Right, so whenever the MACD is below the lower band, I guess normally that would here. I guess let me just show you. So if I use the upper band for long and shorts, then what happens, right, is whenever the MACD line is below the upper band, we're getting a short signal. Right, so we're simply just looking is the MACD above or below the upper band. However, we can change that and say, well, we're really not interested when the MACD is above or below the upper band. We're really interested when the MACD is below the lower band for a short situation. So we can just select the lower band to look at our short outputs. And that's how we got this, kind of unique setup here. So let's just take a look at this again. All right. So the comparison solver is basically it's detecting condition 1. Making sure that the MACD is in the right relationship with our Bollinger Bands. And then the crossover solver actually triggers the trade. So we have to wait for price, right, to cross our linear regression before we take the trade. So, and yeah, so here's some other examples going into a short, right? So who knows if this is any good. I wouldn't trust it, but I guess it would be fun just for you guys to practice this. Put it together and back test it. It's good practice. All right, Celso, I hope I covered it, everything there for you. Let's see. Let me ask you guys a question. Do any of you use like some kind of indicator that gives you support and resistance lines? Something similar to like pivot lines or Murray math lines? Are any of you out there using those? Yeah, so Bob is suggesting the pivot lines, the floor trader pivots. And let's see, Dan is saying TSI, Celso's temporary pivots. Oh, I see. So Celso, I guess you're referring to like hourly pivots or something like that, maybe. All right. Well, so I guess what I'm getting from all this is, some of you are. So how about if I cover the support and resistance solver? There we go, near the bottom down there. So, all right. Before I do that, let me put a pivot indicator on here. All right, just another reminder, keep in mind Ninja traders recognize that when you use their pivot indicators, such as the pivots or the Woody pivots, when you have it set to calculate from daily bars, that there is an internal issue with Ninja Trader. Sometimes doesn't build the daily bars. Basically, they don't build the daily bars quick enough, and so therefore sometimes this indicator doesn't work inside of other indicators or a strategy. So the recommendation is, when you're using their pivot indicator, that you have to use calculate from intraday data when you're using their pivots indicator in a strategy or inside of another indicator. So remember, so when you're using this pivot indicator inside of BloodHound, BloodHound is another indicator. So to get it to work correctly, you'll need to use calculate from intraday data. So if we can take a look at that. All right. So there's some pivot lines on the chart. All right. So Celso's got a good question, but I guess I kind of got started on this one. So let me I'll give you guys just a quick recap on the support resistance solver. So let me start a new logic template. And I'll drop a support resistance solver down in here. Alright, so first I'll cover the headwind mode, and I'm going to keep this as simple as I can. So I'm not going to go into detail, but just a suggestion. Typically, you're going to want to turn this must agree with swing trend off. Right, so we'll turn that off. Then the next thing to do is to turn the use indicator on, and now we can use our pivot indicator. I'll go in here and set the pivot indicator up. And you'll notice one thing about the support resistance solver is it has this check all box here. So we can actually analyze all of the plot lines available here. Right? But to keep this kind of simple, I'm just going to look at the R3 line here. Since that's right there on my chart, we'll just isolate this example to the R3 and leave all the others turned off. And now the next step is to go in and set up our distances. So I'm going to set these to ticks instead of ATRs, because ticks is just a lot easier to see on the chart. And so we're in headwind mode. So let's use something like, how about 10 ticks? That should be pretty simple to see. And I made the mistake that I was just explaining to you guys about. I left this on daily bars. And let's put this on intraday. There we go. Okay, now we're getting the correct results here. Alright, so if we look at this chart, right, and let me go back to the solver. So keep in mind we have our distances, our ideal and our minimum distances set to 10 ticks. Just both the same to keep this kind of simple. So what that did is it created, let me delete this, and I'll shrink that line down to just 1. Alright, so what it did is when we set the support resistance solver to this 10 tick difference or distance, it kind of created a zone around our R3 line here. There, we pull this out. Oh. So it created this 10 tick zone around the R3 line. And let me, I'll draw a 10 tick offset here. Alright, so we have these white lines that are 10 ticks above and 10 ticks below the R3 line. And next, how about if I'm going to take price, I'm going to take the price and change it to a line so that's easier to visualize. And alright, so here's a line, the orange line of the closing price. Now, you can see whenever price over in this area here, right, over in this area here, whenever it's below, right, this 10 tick offset, right, the 10 tick offset represented by this dashed white line here, right, so remember, so this white line is a 10 tick offset from our R3 line. And so we can see whenever price is below it, look at the long output from BloodHound. Let me kind of increase BloodHound here. So, right, you can see we have a long output from BloodHound. And what that's telling you is that price is more than 10 ticks away from the R3 line. And so that we have enough distance to take a long trade. And now, as soon as the closing price right here goes above our 10 tick offset, so now price is basically 9 ticks away from the R3 line. And look right down here, right here, there's no long output. So the support resistance solver is telling us we're too close to the R3 line to take a trade. And then another example right here. So now price, drops back down, and now price is 10 ticks away from the R3 line. And so once again, we're okay to take a long trade, and therefore we have a long output here. And now we can see this entire area here price is essentially within 10 ticks or less to the R3 line, and we can see there's no long output because basically we're too close to the R3 line to take a long trade into the R3 line. So that's kind of what the support resistance solver headwind mode is for. Is so it'll prevent you from taking a trade when you're too close to your indicator line, right? And you could use anything as your support and resistance. You could use this linear regression line as your support resistance, whatever it is, whatever indicator plot that you like to use for your support and resistance lines. That's what the solver will do. Is in headwind mode, it'll tell you when you're too close to your line, so that you do not take a trade when you're going into that line. And so now we can see as soon as price breaks that line out here, now you can see we have a long output. So we broke above the line, and so now we're okay to take a long trade because we broke through the R3 resistance line, and we're okay to take a trade. So, and so it's also calculating the opposite. So if we look at this area here, right? So price is right above the R3 line, but inside this 10 tick area here, inside this 10 tick offset area, and you'll notice that we don't have any short outputs from BloodHound down here. All right, so BloodHound, the solver is telling us that price is too close to the R3 line to take a short trade into the R3 line. Until finally, price breaks out of this 10 tick range area. Alright, let me minimize that, and so now let's cover tailwind mode real quick. So that's headwind mode. So next I'll switch this over to tailwind mode. And let me change my distances here. Alright, so I set them to ticks so they're easy to see. And how about if we look for just a simple 3-tick distance. 3-tick distance. And let me adjust these lines to reflect that. Alright, so now my white dashed lines here are 3 ticks offset from the R3. And tailwind mode is pretty simple to visualize. Right, so we can see in this area, as soon as price goes inside of this 3-tick area, BloodHound is saying, you know what, we're right up against our resistance line, and so look for a short trade. You might get a bounce, so kind of tailwind mode is kind of giving you the setup for a possible bounce trade off of your resistance line. Right, and once again, price comes up to R3, and the solver says, hey, we could get a bounce off of this because we're within this 3-tick zone. And then finally price breaks out, and the solver knows that that price is above the R3 line, and so it's telling you, you could look for a long trade now. So that's kind of what tailwind is for. Tailwind essentially tells you when price gets really close to your support resistance lines. So if you're looking for a bounce trade off of those. So Celso is asking, how would you detect when price crosses a higher high after having made a lower high? All right. Let me clear my chart objects off here. So let's see. So I'm going to use the swing high-low indicator. And I'm going to need to turn these tightest plots on. So let's see. Alright, I think this setup will work, and let me just put this back on candlesticks. There. We can see that okay. Let me go in and adjust the indicator here a little bit. So let's see if I change the sensitivity to 4. There we go. Okay. So let's see. Condition 1 is we wanted to have made a higher low, such as what we have here. Alright, so we have, if here's a low and here's a low, and we can see this higher low was made, and we can tell that because, right, the dots, see how the dots moved up? So the dots moved up when a higher low was made. The hash line, the darker red hash line, that is picking up the lowest lows, whereas the dots are picking up the higher lows. And the opposite is true for the blue lines, right? And so we can see we had this high point made right here. And so we're going to find this higher low made by looking for the dots to step up, and then we'll wait for price to cross this higher high. Alright, so to set this up, let me shrink my chart up a little bit here. Alright, so we're going to look, first we're going to look from when the dots are stepping up. Right, so we'll look for that condition first, and then we'll look for price crossing the swing indicator plot. So let me make a new template for this, and let's see. So we're looking for a higher low, and then a higher high, what, price crossover. Alright, so let's see, I'm going to use the comparison solver first. So what I'm going to do now, I'm using the comparison solver in a slightly different way in how I explained it right earlier. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be comparing, let's see, let me scroll the chart over here. So I'm going to be comparing this dot. You know, let's pretend like this is the current bar on your chart. So I'm going to be comparing this current dot from the swing indicator to the dot one bar back. Right? That's how I can tell when there's a jump in the dots, when the dots, you know, had moved price. So that's what I'm going to do here. And the way I can do that is I can use the displacement function here. Okay? But the first step I need to do is set up my indicators. And remember, I changed the sensitivity up to 4. And let's see, the dotted plot line is the bottoms. And I'll use the tightest tops for the short signals. So this should generate a short signal in the opposite, when the opposite conditions are made. Alright, I need to go set up indicator B exactly the same way. Alright, change my parameter settings, and yeah, set the longs here and the shorts up there. Now we're not going to get anything until we set our displacement to 1. So now if we look at the chart, so we can see here the dotted line jumped up and we got a long signal, and the dotted line jumped up and we got another long signal. Right? Here, I'm going to make these dots a little bigger. There we go. And the way I set this up, the opposite is true for the blue dots. So when the blue dots drop down, you know what? I should make that a little easier to see. There we go. Alright, now the dots stick out a little bit better. Alright, so now we can clearly see when the blue dots drop down, and we're getting a short, a short output for this. So there's the first step. So I'll name this like the higher low, and lower high detection, something like that. All right, and then the next one, we're going to just use a simple crossover and find when price crosses over our highest high plot, our highest high swing. So I'll set this to the closing price, and then indicator B I need to set to our highest high and lowest low plots. So we'll set this to our swing indicator. Right, and we're using the highest highs are basically the whitest tops. Right, so the darker blue hash line is the whitest tops plot, and the darker red hash line is the whitest bottoms. So there we go. Oh, I didn't change that. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so now we can see right here that price. Oops. Let me grab that circle. There we go. Price crossed above our swing high plot line. So now we just need a way to link these conditions together. So what we have to do is we have, right, condition 1. I'll mark a little arrow here. And mark a little arrow here. There we go. So there's condition 1 happening, our higher low. And then we have condition 2 happening over here. Right, so we need to find a way to link these two together. And let's see. How about I'll try and use the toggle node to do this. So with the toggle node, let's see, when we get a signal coming into the toggle node, I want to force it on, and then if we get an opposite signal, I believe I'll want to force it off. And let's see, the reset, we will need to use the reset and force this toggle node off, I believe. And let's see, I'm not sure if we need to change the on opposite signal. So I'll just leave it as it is. And so kind of what I've created right now is it's telling us, right, when we're getting higher lows forming. And let me change the scaling here. So it's telling us when higher lows are forming right now. And actually, oops. I'm sorry, I have the wrong solver plugged in here. Let's connect our higher low and lower high detector. Plug that in. There we go. So what this is kind of doing right now is when higher lows are forming, right, we're in a long state. And then when lower highs start forming, it switches over to a short state, right? And look, right in here we had this one little, minor wave up, and so we got this little tiny higher low. So we got a few bars of this little tiny step up, and then once again we got our lower highs happening again, right? So the toggle node, right, is telling us when our higher lows are happening or when our lower highs are happening. And the next step is to turn the toggle off as soon as, there we go, as soon as price, right, crossed. You see here, let me scale this back out again. So right here, as soon as the closing price, right, crossed our higher high, it turned the toggle node off. So that way we don't continue to keep getting more and more signals, right? However, you'll notice, remember the arrows right here? I drew these arrows on the original bars that had the signal. So if we actually look at our crossover, see, it's on this bar right here, marked with the arrow. So now let's look at our toggle node again, and look, we're not having an output on the same bar. So the toggle node gets turned off one bar too soon. So what we'll have to do is build a delay into that. So we can use the look back here to build a delay into it. Alright, so let's take a look at this. And so just the look back's default settings here, it has a displacement of 1, and so its default setting is, right, shifting the signal forward 1 bar. So you see how it shifted it forward 1 bar? So if I set this back to 0, if I turn the displacement off, right, now the signal is right back on the original bar. And we actually want to use this displacement here to delay the signal forward 1 bar. So now if we look at the toggle node, plug this into the reset. Now look, the toggle node has a long signal on the bar where price crosses above or higher high. So, right, that's kind of the reason why I love having this toolbar on my charts, so I can start marking where solver outputs are occurring. It helps me visualize things quicker. So now we take an AND node, right? So before I plug this AND node in, just to recap, this toggle node, right, it's telling us when a higher low formed, and it's holding on to the signal it's holding on to that higher low condition until price crosses over the swing high, right? And so now if we join the toggle node in with, I should give this a name here, shouldn't I? So we're looking for the close crossing over the higher high or lower low. So if we look at our chart, right, we're looking at when the higher lows are forming and when the lower highs are forming, and now if we actually put our price crossing over the highest high signal in there, and bingo, there we go. So now we have it. There's our signal. All right, there you go, Celso. All right, Celso wanted me to take a look at Renko bars real quick. All right, Renkos. There we go. There's some 5 brick Renkos for you. So let's take a look at this. You know, so we have this higher low made right here. Right, that's coming back from way back here. And then price, oops, let me grab that circle. And then price crosses our highest high right here. Let's see, and Celso's asking, are there any shorts? There probably are. Here we go. So we have a lower high made. Right. So there's our lower high. And then this lowest low right there was broken. So, alright, good deal. Alright, so it looks like Celso's happy with that. Ken wants to know how to do an MA slope. Alright, so let me remove all the drawing objects here. Alright, Ken. So I'm going to use this linear regression since I already have it on my chart. Right? This is a form of a moving average. And I'll beef this up, make it easier to see. There. Alright, so the way you work with checking the slope of a moving average, let me start a new logic template. Right, so an MA slope, and what we'll do is we'll use the slope solver. So down here under indicator slope. Right, we'll plug that in, and right now you'll notice that it's defaulted to the SMA 14. So let's go in and we'll switch it over to the linear regression slope. So there we go, linear regression, and we happen to have an 80 period on the chart, so let's switch this over to an 80 period. And right, there's only one plot out of this, so we don't have nothing to change. And if we look, right, if we look at the chart, we can see right, the solver is detecting when the slope is rising, and we get a long signal out of it when the slope is rising, and when the slope is falling, we're getting a short output from that solver. So pretty straightforward there. Now let's say, let me find Let me find a flat area here. Well, I'll see if I can work in this area here. Because I'm using a Ranko, yeah, you know what, how about if I switch this back over to like a 5 range, and that might generate some more flat areas. Yeah, here we go. Perfect. So let's see if we can kind of eliminate this area where the linear regression is a little flat there. And the way we can do that is we can use these maximum and minimum slope parameters here. So let's see what happens if we just put in one tick of maximum slope. Now you can see it wiped out quite a bit. So the linear regression line has to start sloping up quite a bit and before we get an output here. And look at BloodHound's output down here. You can see it's kind of in this fuzzy logic mode right now. You know, if I didn't want a fuzzy logic mode, I can change the minimum slope to 1 tick as well. And now you can see it got rid of the fuzzy logic, that analog type of an output. And now it's just a nice, clean, on-off signals. However, let's say 1 tick is a little too steep. Let's try 0.5 ticks. See how that works. And I'm going to set the minimum back down to 0. You know, 0.5, half a tick is, you know, it still looks to be a little steep. So let's knock it down to 0.25. And there we go. That's a little better. We try even a little less. Oh, actually, let me try a little more. Sorry, 0.3 ticks. There we go. So that kind of helped eliminate these flat areas here. You know, depending on how price moves, you know, you still might get this one odd occasional, you know, signal right in the middle there. Yeah, that, you know, this one bar, this one signal here happened, you know, just because price had a little bit of a pullback here. And so that pulled our linear regression down just enough, you know, right, to kind of trigger a short signal there. But that's kind of a quick overview there for you, Ken. All right, you know, just for those of you who like to look for these, if you go to our YouTube channel here, right, so the way you can get there, turn that video off. All right, the way you can get there is you can go to youtube.com/shark indicators. So let me put that in there just like that. So if you put in youtube.com/shark indicators, right, and that takes you to our page, so you don't actually have to put that user in there. And you'll see the first set of videos here, these uploads. You know, this is where this shows you the most recent uploads in order. So you can see, yeah, last week's workshop video is right here. BloodHound workshop right there. And last week we worked on the linear regression slope system. You can just take a look in this uploads section here, and they're all listed in order of date. So you can see right when it's uploaded. Also, you could also subscribe if you have a Gmail account. You can subscribe to this channel, and then Gmail will email you whenever a new video is uploaded. Right, so whenever one of these workshop videos gets uploaded, you get a notice. So thank you very much for joining me today, and we'll see you next Friday.